tonight. Now, as we always do each weekend, we love to have some fantastic guests on the show. And tonight is no different. We're delighted to say that we're joined on the line now by Louise Hulland. She is a Sony award-winning journalist, a presenter and documentary maker. And she joins us tonight to talk about her brand new book. It's called Stolen Lives, Human Trafficking and Slavery in Britain Today. Now, Jeremy Vine, broadcaster Jeremy Vine, of course, and fellow BBC colleague, has said, for those who doubt that slavery exists in the 21st century Britain, this is the book. In it, Louise Hulland presents the story of one woman, known simply as Alina, but it is the repeated tragedy of millions. Well, to tell us more about it, we are joined by Louise. Louise, thank you so much for joining us on a Sunday night. It's great to have you on the show.
Oh, thank you for having me. What a lovely introduction. Thank you so much.
Now, I've got to say, when Sunny and I were talking about yourself, I mean, you know, you've done so much work over the years. We thought, wow, there's so much we can talk about. But the honest truth is, when you look at the book and the subject matter, and I wonder if you've dealt with this yourself, that there will be people who think, oh, God, I don't want to hear about this. This is not what, you know, this is not a subject I want to even know about. Do you find that often when you discuss human trafficking, modern day slavery, and the idea that it's happening here in this country, that it's happening in London right now as we talk, is that something that people kind of tend to want to switch off from?
Yeah, it's been weird. Until I wrote the book, it was something that was a kind of personal interest, a bit of a passion project, and
right.
A kind of thing that I was researching kind of away from work and sort of wanting to build it into my work. And if I sort of mentioned, you know, people would say, oh, you're a journalist, what are you working on right now? And I'd start talking passionately about human trafficking and the fight against slavery. And you could see sort of maybe at parties people glazing over and going, all right, mate, it's Friday night, chill out.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
But it was definitely something that gripped people as well, because I think so many people just go, hang on a minute, that can't be right. That happened, 200 years ago, or it happened in other countries. It doesn't happen here, but sadly, it absolutely does, and it's happening all around us.
Is the misconception, please be frank about this, because when we were discussing this with producer Kyla as well, and we were talking a lot about, you know, the term slavery, as you've just mentioned, a lot of people will affiliate the word slavery with, of course, what happened, you know, hundreds of years ago. But if we talk about modern day slavery and human trafficking, often people affiliate that with countries such as Africa or countries such as India, or, you know, countries where, or even, you know, third world countries. They would never think that it's happening here. Has that been quite a barrier for you to break down when you're talking about this, for people to really come to terms with the fact that, as you've just said, it's happening on our doorstep, it's happening here right now?
Yeah, kind of. I think people have kind of, once I've started talking to them and explaining how it's happening here, they've sort of had their eyes open and said, oh, actually, yeah, okay, that's really worth thinking about. So, anecdotally, we've sort of seen in the media so many stories over the last few years about slavery in nail bars, slavery in car washes, the kind of those places that have had quite a lot of attention. But, you know, we're also talking about farmlands and agriculture. Obviously, that doesn't affect us in London, but it affects other parts of the country, the hospitality industry, and also cleaning as well. Like, I'm not talking about your sort of domestic worker that pops in once a week and does your Thursday clean. I'm talking about big companies that subcontract so much work that then gets subcontracted again. So I think people think slavery and they automatically think shackles and buying and selling people, when actually these traffickers and these slave gangs are incredibly clever. They might not use physical restraints, but they use psychological and emotional restraints. So they hold fear over the people that they've got entrapped. So it could be, you owe us a debt. We're going to kill your family in Vietnam or Africa or wherever, because we know where they are and you have to work for us. We will kill them if you don't. Or they use sort of emotional manipulation, like, if you escape from me, if you go out onto the street, the police in Britain, they won't believe you. They're like your police back home. They're just going to think you're lying. So there are very, very clever, manipulative ways of people keeping people emotionally in chains, if not in physical chains.
Louise, what is what are these individuals and how do they fall into this trap? Because we've seen this week in Dover, there's been protests by the far right about migrants coming here, and also there's been a counter protest as well. Are we looking at those kind of individuals who are coming here who are trying to flee from another country where they were persecuted, or are we looking at people who are coming generally here for work but they keep falling into the wrong traps because they haven't got the right paperwork? What do these individuals look like, and how can we recognize them even if we were walking on the street?
So it could be anything. And let me tell you, because this really shocked me. So there is a system called the National Referral Mechanism. When someone is rescued from slavery, they are put into that system if they want to do so. That's how we identify how many slaves that we know have been rescued and how they get their support. And for the last 2 years, the biggest nationality of people that went into that system were British.
What? Wow. People from our own country were falling into this?
Yes.
Wow.
British people were the highest people that had been rescued from slavery. Now, modern slavery is like an umbrella term, so all different things can come under that, whether it's sexual exploitation, labour exploitation, or enforced criminality. So one of the things that British people get, sort of one of the crimes that they're targeted for is drug trafficking. So you hear the phrase county lines many, many times now. And what used to happen was you'd sort of look at a kid travelling up and down the country selling drugs, you'd think, well, they're a little criminal. Now what's happened as sort of time's moved on, we've realised that actually the gangs are controlling those kids. They are vulnerable people, and that's what it all comes down to. Traffickers know how to target vulnerable people. So to go back to your point about the migrant crisis, what tends to happen is, as I mentioned, I can't stress enough how manipulative and clever these traffickers are. Their number one goal is to find vulnerable people, whatever that vulnerability is. So when we're looking at the migrant crisis now, people that are fleeing war, famine, natural disasters, they are homeless, they are desperate, they're trying to get somewhere. Now, of course, we hear a lot about people smuggling, but that's different to human trafficking. People smuggling is when you kind of have a bit of a mutual deal going on. So say, for example, Sunny, I say to you, look, I'll give you X £1,000, get me from A to B. You say, sure enough, we get to B, we go our separate ways. Human trafficking is different. That's when you would say to me, you know what, Louise, I've got an offer of a job for you. Why don't you come to London and work in a cocktail bar? Why don't you come to Manchester and work in a hotel? It's the deception and it's the coercion.
Right. Okay.
So actually, a lot of people will be targeting these desperate people fleeing war zones, and they will think that it's a mutual decision. They will think that they're actually paying them to come to have a new life. But at the end of it, when they think they will go their separate ways, actually, these traffickers will then actually not let them go and will put them into some kind of work or hold a debt over them or take their papers. So smuggling is that, I see that quite a lot in the media, that the two terms are quite interchangeable and they're quite often wrong.
It's an interesting point. I mean, we're learning just, hearing from you, Louise. And before we talk about the book, because that's, kind of a culmination really of all of the, the investigations that you've been doing over the past 10 years. This isn't new for you. You've been looking into victims of modern slavery and human trafficking since 2010. But I just wanted to kind of find out from you on a personal level, firstly, where did this begin for you? Why the interest for you on a personal level to want to investigate and look into modern day slavery? Because a lot of people would, even us hearing it now, it is so heavy on your heart, right? This isn't some kind of a subject matter that you can just switch off. At the end of the day, when you talk about this, you recognize that this is affecting a person's life and their family's lives. How has it been for you? Why have you decided? Where did it all come about where you thought, no, this is what I want to investigate?
So there were two kind of trigger points. The first one, as you all know as journalists, is when you think, hang on, that's a story. Right. And that was around in 2010 when I'd actually gone for coffee with an old university lecturer who was telling me he and a couple of members of his team were sort of looking into organised crime around sporting events. So he sort of told me about human trafficking then. I was like, hang on, I was like everyone else, like that can't happen now. And that kind of triggered my journalistic interest and the fact that I'd done sociology of crime at university. So from an organised crime point of view, that kind of got my journalistic juices flowing. And I kind of worked on it for a few years. And then what changed massively for me was actually met a survivor. And that changed everything, because you sort of sit down with someone who's been through this, and you look into their eyes and you see what it's been done to them, and all of a sudden, you're not looking at the statistics of 40 million people around the world in slavery. You're looking at one person. Because sometimes I think, as human beings, when there's a disaster or some kind of huge trauma that we suffer as people, there's so many numbers involved, you can't process them. And you almost need to meet one person who's gone through it for it to be able to hit home. And it was meeting Elena, whose story we tell in the book. That was the thing that changed everything for me, because it went from being this awful crime to being something that happened to a woman that was sitting in front of me. And that was hugely moving for me.
So talk us through the book Stolen Lives, because it's really powerful and moving in terms of the testimony that you've got from survivors, kind of, talking about individual stories. But as you've just said, this book is the story of one woman, Elena. So what can you tell us about the book without giving too much away?
Well, the main thing was I wanted to give survivors their voices back. And what I didn't want to do was to kind of string their stories together without a kind of overview of how we've got to where we are. I wanted it to be a kind of positive, hopeful book, which sounds completely ridiculous. I do appreciate that. But I did want to have that sense of positivity and hope at the end of it, because I wanted to make sure that anyone reading it feels a sense of purpose and feel that they can actually contribute to the end, or at least starting the end of modern day slavery. So the spine of the story is Elena. She was a young student in Albania when she fell in love with a young man who took her on holiday to meet his family. Now, sadly, she thought after a 6-month relationship that an engagement was on the horizon. That's why she went to Belgium to meet his family. However, there was no family. When he took her to meet his friends, he left her, and it was actually a brothel that he'd taken her to. And she spent 10 months trapped in a brothel in Belgium. She fell pregnant during that period as well. And some things happened to her that I know about that I didn't put in the book, because if her child ever reads that book, I did not want that to be in print. That was down. Right. That would potentially be for her to tell that child one day, and I don't really want to go into what triggered her leaving, but essentially she was so terrified of what the traffickers would do once they knew that she was pregnant. The threats that they made, they sort of let her have a little bit of time off, for want of a better word, from the sex work, because she was so pregnant, but she knew what fate was awaiting her once she gave birth, and she knew she couldn't let that happen. So she managed to escape one night and came to the UK. So we sort of met then, and that's when her story with me kind of takes over, and that's the sort of second part of her story, the story of her in London and what happens to her.
Happens next.
What happens next. And the thing is, you can't really tell those stories without having the kind of the context within it. So also we speak to police officers up and down the country who are fighting this crime, to charities that are supporting. I don't know if you know or not, but it's actually the Salvation Army who are the first port of call when someone's rescued.
No, do you know? I mean, slavery. Louise, I just said this to you 20 minutes ago. I'm learning so much. It's so important that we talk about
Salvation Army.
Salvation Army. I wouldn't have known. So if somebody says, sorry, tell us again, because I've interjected there. Tell us what you're saying. If Salvation Army is the first point of call for what?
Yeah, so when someone is rescued from slavery and identified as a victim, the Salvation Army have the contract from the government to take care of them, and whether it's through them directly or whether it's subcontracted through other charities. And I don't know about you, but I think the Salvation Army performing outside John Lewis on Oxford Street at Christmas. I did not know that they did this.
Exactly, so, I agree. I've only ever thought of, when you think of, I think you're right, when you think of Salvation Army, you think of that, absolutely. Christmas carols, you think of homelessness, and when they're heading out in the middle of the night to help those that are in need. But I would have never ever equated Salvation Army with providing that support, as you say, being the first port of call if you are a victim of human trafficking or modern day slavery.
Yeah, and also there was a lawyer that I really wanted to speak to who'd been instrumental in putting the Modern Slavery Act together and also prosecuting some of the really early cases. And she was just fantastic. And I happened to be with her when she was prosecuting the biggest case of modern day slavery we've ever seen in the UK. So I follow her during that period as well. Plus, like I say, the survivors' stories, we speak to people who are psychologists who help put them on their path to recovery, and also sort of political players as well. Sadly, the Home Office would have been interviewed for the book. They couldn't make that happen. But we also look at sort of the government policy around what we're doing for modern day slavery. So it's really, I like to think it's kind of weaving. You have a really sort of challenging chapter listening to a survivor's story, but then a bit of a gear change to find out, well, actually, she's been through that, what should have happened.
Yeah.
And also as well, I don't know about you as a consumer, I really want to be a good consumer, but I find the issue of supply chains and slavery abroad so confusing in terms of, with my phone, it's made up of so many components. How
exactly.
on earth
Who do you hold accountable? I mean, like, I know in the past there's been a lot of, and we've seen it I would say in the last 2 to 3 years, where people are now holding, stores accountable, whether it's Primark or Topshop or, Zara or whatever, in terms of, who is actually making these, very cheap clothes. And
and here's the other
following
thing
that journey of slavery in terms of, young children that are sometimes forced to work.
Exactly. And the other thing that I found out, which I found equally shocking, or surprising, I guess, was the fact that we sort of think cheap-end goods, that's got to be dodgy. Yeah. But actually, factories in India or China are making garments for the lower end of the market, but also the top end of the market.
Exactly.
So actually, you might think, oh my goodness, is my Primark $9.99 tops touched by slavery, but also is my $5,000 Prada, and not that I literally own anything $5,000 from there, but so actually it's all about, it was really interesting to do that, because I as a consumer want to do my best, but found it completely overwhelming. So I found speaking to experts in that area really helpful as well. So
I think you're right. I think, the more we talk about this, more we recognise that it's so interlinked. We can't judge the individual who will shop at, and there are many other shops available and brands available, but who will shop at the lower end for various reasons, without thinking, oh, well, if you're spending the hundreds and thousands of pounds, well, actually, you should be held accountable too, because you don't know where your products are coming from. You don't know how they're being made.
So what I found really helpful was one of the people that sort of works helping businesses have clean supply chains. They said 2 things. If someone says to you, we are slavery free, they can't. They just can't. Supply chains are so complicated. There's no way of knowing. But what you do need to know is find out what they're doing about it. So if every company that turns over more than £36 million a year has to have a modern slavery supply chain statement. And some of them are just a load of fluff, like, oh yeah, slavery is bad, we don't like it. But the really good brands, the ones that are really, really behind cutting out slavery in their supply chains, will have a really forensic kind of almost audit on their statement of, this is how we find it, that we found it here, but we did this. We think it might be there, we're going to do that.
Okay.
And actually, a lot of the brands that you think, oh, they're cheap, they're dodgy, are actually working so hard. So you mentioned Primark there. Actually, they are one of the brands that I was told several times working really hard in that area. So actually, if you ever have a doubt, just check out the modern slavery statement and see how thorough you think it is. And that's usually pretty good.
I think Louise, we could probably hold a 3-hour lecture with you and learn
I know,
so
I'm
much.
So sorry. I was
going to say in the most important way, because it's been so enlightening, but it's at the same time been so engaging. And I think that's what I suspect a lot of people will describe your book, Stolen Lives, as. It's going to be enlightening. It's going to be horrific to read, but at the same time, there's going to be things that you're going to think, well, I didn't know that. But also thought-provoking. It's such a pleasure having you on the show, Louise. We'll have to get you in the studio.
I love you guys. I love you guys. I'm such a fan of you too. I have been for years, so it's a pleasure to be on.
Wow, that's really kind of you to say. I feel very humbled. Genuinely, I think what you're doing is amazing. And,
Thank you.
Honestly, wish you the best, but you'll have to come back on, because I have a feeling this isn't the end of the road when it comes to your investigative work around this. I feel like this is going to be a lifelong passion project for you.
Thank you.
And you're doing the best work. So thank you for joining us tonight, Louise. Pleasure having you on the show.
Thank you.
Take care. What a fantastic woman. Louise Hulland, as I mentioned earlier on, she is a Sony award-winning journalist, presenter, and also author of Stolen Lives. If you'd like further details, head to her website, louisehulland.com. You can find her on Twitter @LouiseOnAir.